Is sourdough bread good for your gut? Find out on this next episode of Digest This.
Welcome to Digest This, the show that helps you revolutionize your digestive health. Here are your hosts, Dr. Liz Cruz and Tina Nunziato.
Hello and welcome to Digest This. I'm Dr. Liz Cruz and I've got Tina Nunziato sitting right here by my side if you're watching us on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're a first-time listener, we welcome you to the family. And if you're one of our regular listeners, thank you for being on this journey and for being one of our loyal listeners or watchers. So, what about sourdough bread? Sourdough bread is so good. First of all, let's start out with that. Sourdough bread is so good.
Sourdough bread reminds me of San Francisco.
Always, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you've been Bodines, the sourdough, the clam chowder, and those sourdough bowls.
Delicious.
So good.
Yeah, but I hear from patients all the time, especially people with GI issues. They say that they eat sourdough bread more than any other bread because they've heard that it's good for the gut. So I had somebody last week that said that, so I thought it would be good to talk about on the podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, definitely probably better than most breads out there. All right? I mean, Tina and I eat Ezekiel bread. Ezekiel bread is live sprouted grains. You know, it's a live sprouted grains, and so because of that, it just makes it a more wholesome, natural, raw food kind of, so to speak, right? Bread, and in fact, you have to even keep it refrigerated because of the live grains.
Well, and it's found in the refrigerated section too.
Exactly. So that's what we eat. We eat Ezekiel bread, and I've heard of another one. There's another one that we don't eat it, but it's called Dave's it's another one that also is made out of like sprouted, live sprouted grains. And so that's what we eat.
But his has a couple extra things in it that I don't like.
Oh, so you're familiar with it. Okay. All right.
I'm not trying to get people to switch over to Ezekiel bread just because it's really, really clean. It has no yeast.
Yep.
It's just a really, really clean bread. And even though the number one ingredient is wheat, it's cracked wheat. It's not processed wheat. And so people with gluten issues actually do really well on Ezekiel bread. So
it's not, so why is that important? Mainly, I mean, because it's not processed, right?
Right.
I mean, because one of the big things with wheat, and especially with the whole issue with gluten is the whole processing of the wheat.
I mean, and this is the thing I tell patients is that, you know, wheat has been around for centuries, right? And we haven't had the issues with wheat that we've had in the last 20, 30 years, right? Up until 20, 30 years ago. And it's mainly because of how they're processing the wheat. And this goes for salt too. We're going to have this conversation later about salt. But wheat is actually fine for the body. It's just that when it goes through the processing that we put it through, it's literally stripped of everything that's good about it and chemicals are added. And it's those things that are causing us to be sick. So when you eat Ezekiel bread, it's not processed wheat, it's cracked wheat. And again, much easier to digest. And people tend to not have issues, the same issues with it. No yeast in the product, which is good to keep the yeast out of the body.
You definitely want to toast the bread.
Yes, because it's cold.
Yeah, it's cold, and you definitely want to toast it. But anyway, so over to sourdough bread. So sourdough bread, there's several things. I mean, we pulled up several different articles on it, and over and over you see that it's easier to digest, okay? And that probably has to do a lot with the fermentation process. The fermentation process is done with what they call wild yeast, which actually I never heard of, wild yeast.
Not baker's yeast.
Yeah, not the baker's yeast. And supposedly supposed to be a better type of yeast. And it just helps as far as like the formation of prebiotics, which are basically food for bacteria. Food for bacteria. So definitely easier to digest.
So because the bread sits there so long fermenting, it basically allows the wheat to break down more, right? So by the time the bread is baked, the wheat is broken down more, so it's easier to digest.
And actually, exactly right. And to that point, there's even talk out there that it might even be tolerated by people who have celiac disease, because of that fermentation process and with what happens to the wheat.
Right.
You know, that by the time that you're actually eating it, like a lot of that has been broken down to make it easier
Right.
to digest. So, but at this point, we're not saying, and there's nothing out there that's saying if you're a celiac, eat sourdough bread and you'll be fine. At least not that I'm aware of, and that's not what we're saying.
Yeah, it still has gluten.
Yes.
So actually, really the difference, and this is how I try to explain to people, the difference between celiac and gluten sensitivity, quote unquote sensitivity. Like if you were just gluten sensitive, you can probably eat sourdough bread just fine. But celiac, you might be still not great because, you know, just the way the body reacts to the gluten. So that's the one thing with sourdough bread is it still has gluten, right? So you have to be careful with that.
Very good. Yes. Another thing with sourdough bread is that it has a lower glycemic index. All right. So glycemic index basically just means that, you know, it's a carbohydrate, and so carbohydrates are going to break down into sugars. And so glycemic index is an indicator of how quickly your glucose levels go up. And so with this, sourdough bread has a low glycemic, meaning that glucose levels go up slower. Okay, so they don't spike, because that's what you don't want. You don't want a spike in your glucose or your sugar levels.
And typically with carbs, typically bad carbs, you know, that's when you get the spike.
Right.
A lot of times. So yeah, the lower glycemic foods
Right.
are definitely better. So sourdough falls into that category, whereas white or wheat bread wouldn't fall into that category.
Right.
Yeah.
Because of the type of yeast, I mean, supposedly it's like we said already, it's not baker's yeast. There's less yeast in the bread as opposed to a different type of bread. What else? It's
so the bacteria.
Oh, the
let's talk about
bacteria.
the bacteria, because a lot of patients will tell me, well, I eat it because it has good bacteria in it. Okay. So, and again, that's just because of the way it ferments. That's where that idea comes from. The thing is that once that bread is baked, the probiotic or the bacteria that's in that actually dies. Okay, a bacteria is not going to survive that baking process.
Right.
The thing that the sourdough bread does have, it is high in fiber. And the fiber is actually, like what you mentioned earlier, is a good prebiotic for the body, which is still a bacteria that helps feed other bacteria, right? So it actually does have prebiotic in it, but not probiotic. So I want to make sure that we talked about that, because I think a lot of patients think that, you know, if they just eat sourdough bread, they don't need to take a probiotic,
right,
for example.
Yeah. No, you should still be taking a probiotic. So another thing is, which I didn't know, is that sourdough bread does have, like, it's a good source of fiber. It's a healthier form of a starch or carbohydrate. Also has some protein and some nutrients. Okay, so it actually has more nutrients in it than I realized. Makes me want to go back to San Francisco and just eat a clam chowder and a sourdough bread every week.
Yeah, right. There's a good excuse to go back to San Francisco. Anytime.
All right. So what else? So it's funny because I went to San Diego a few months ago with a couple of my kids. I took them out there for a concert, and then the next day we went for breakfast before we were heading back to Phoenix. And the waiter was a gentleman, and he looked like he was in his 60s. Okay, I kid you not. He looked like he was in his 60s. He was actually 80 years old, moving around like nothing. You know, like he looked like one of the young people that were working there. And so somehow it came up. He came over to talk to us. Because he was giving advice to our kids, and he was telling them, you know, just giving them some advice. And he's like, you know, I'm old enough to give you guys advice. I'm 80 years old. And we were like, what? 80 years old? So he said, yep. He goes, I'm 80 years old. He goes, this is what I eat every day for breakfast: sourdough bread and an egg. Sourdough bread and an egg. He goes, I swear by my sourdough bread. So anyways, he felt that was what had promoted his his good health and had kept him looking so good. So, one thing with sourdough bread, as we read some of the articles, it did talk about being a great anti-aging kind of food, and so I found that very interesting.
It's one of the foods listed in the Mediterranean diet.
Yes,
which
yes.
you and I are huge proponents of.
Absolutely.
Right? The Mediterranean diet, and I think just in general, fermented grain-based foods like sourdough bread, they've been known to be antioxidants. They've been known to help with anti-hypertensive, anti-diabetic, like just in general, right? Like just really good overall health type food.
Right.
So I think, that's awesome that he said that.
He really was very adamant that the sourdough bread, just and in general, he did say he ate very healthy. So overall, I mean, just from what we've read on sourdough bread, and it tastes so good. It really does. That tangy flavor that it has is actually from lactic acid, and the lactic acid, but it tastes good. I think that, the next time I go on vacation, I'll be eating sourdough bread every day.
Yeah, it's definitely a nice alternative to whiter wheat
Absolutely.
bread. If you're looking for an alternative, it's definitely going to be healthier than those. Again, there's, like I said, we try to not eat gluten, so that's why we tend to eat Ezekiel bread, wheat that's cracked, not processed. But because that's the main thing with sourdough bread, is it's still processed wheat.
Right.
It just gets broken down better. So, I tell patients if it works for them, eat it. I think it's great. I promote it. But there's a lot of people swear by it.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to connect with us, please go to our website, drlizcruz.com. There is a magenta color button on the homepage. You can click that and you can schedule a free 30-minute wellness consult, and that is done over the phone. So you can do it from anywhere, and that is free. And you don't have to be a patient in our practice. This is for anyone. If you have not rated our program, please rate us. Please give us a 5. It'll help other people like you to find us faster. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will catch you on the next podcast.
Thank you for joining Dr. Liz Cruz and Tina Nunziato. To learn more about their revolutionary products and services, go online to www.drlizcruz.com.